In the winter of 52 BC outside the fortress of Alesia, Gallic warriors pointed at Rome's hastily constructed wooden palisades and laughed until their sides ached. Wood against warriors? They mocked. These Romans build children's toys, not fortifications. But as the morning mist cleared and the siege machines groaned to life, those same wooden walls would become the most ingenious trap in military history, a maze of death that would break the spirit of Gaul forever and teach the world that Roman engineering was not just about stone and mortar, but about turning simplicity into superiority. 52 BC, the plateau of Alesia, eastern Gaul. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and burning oak as Marcus Flavius pressed his weathered palm against the rough bark of a freshly cut log. Around him, 20,000 Roman legionaries moved like ants across the plateau, their bronze helmets catching the pale October sun as they drove stakes into the frozen ground. The sound was rhythmic, methodical, the heartbeat of an empire that had learned to turn desperation into precision. "Sir, the Gauls are watching from the hilltop again," reported Centurion Lucius Varro, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. "They're still laughing." Flavius turned his gaze toward the fortified settlement of Alesia, perched like an eagle's nest on its rocky outcrop. Even from this distance he could see the glint of Celtic mail and the flutter of war banners as Vercingetorix's warriors lined the ramparts. Their laughter carried on the wind, deep, mocking, confident. To them, this Roman construction project must have looked like the desperate flailing of a cornered animal. And perhaps it was. General Gaius Julius Caesar had made a decision that defied every principle of siege warfare. Instead of attempting to storm Alesia's impregnable walls or starve out its defenders through traditional blockade, he had ordered the construction of something unprecedented. A double wall of circumvallation that would trap the Gauls inside while simultaneously protecting the Romans from the massive relief army that was undoubtedly marching toward them. But these walls were not the massive stone fortifications that had made Roman engineering legendary. Time was against them, winter was approaching, and the legions had neither the resources nor the months required to quarry and transport stone. Instead, Caesar had ordered his men to build with wood, simple, rough-hewn logs that the Gauls could see and dismiss as temporary, inadequate, almost laughable. They could not have been more wrong. "Tell me what you see when you look at these walls, Varro," Flavius said, running his hand along the timber construction. The centurion squinted at the wooden palisade rising before them. "Logs, sir. Pointed stakes. Basic fieldwork that any barbarian tribe could construct." Flavius smiled grimly. "And that is exactly what Caesar wants them to see. But look closer. Look at the angles." Varro stepped back, following his commander's gaze. The wooden walls were not simply straight barriers. They formed intricate geometric patterns, salients and redoubts, overlapping fields of fire, carefully calculated blind spots that would force attackers into predetermined killing zones. What appeared to be crude timber construction was actually a masterpiece of military engineering, designed not just to keep enemies out, but to channel them exactly where the Romans wanted them. The inner wall, facing Alesia, stretched for 10 miles in a perfect circle around the hilltop fortress. Every 100 yards, wooden towers rose above the palisade, manned by archers and scorpion artillery. But it was the outer wall that truly demonstrated Caesar's genius, an 11-mile barrier that would protect the Romans from the inevitable relief army while maintaining the siege. Between these two walls lay a no-man's land of carefully prepared death traps. Roman engineers had dug 3 lines of concealed pits, each filled with sharpened stakes and covered with branches and earth. They called them lilies, beautiful flowers that bloomed with blood when stepped upon. Beyond the pits, wolf traps waited in seemingly random patterns, their iron spikes angled to cripple horses and tear the legs from charging warriors. "The Gauls see wood," Flavius explained to his centurion, "but they don't see the mathematics. Every angle has been calculated, every sight line measured. These wooden walls don't just defend, they think." As if to emphasize his point, a group of Celtic scouts had ventured too close to the outer fortifications. From their concealed positions in the wooden towers, Roman archers tracked their movement with mechanical precision. The Gauls moved confidently, clearly believing themselves safely out of range of what they assumed were hastily constructed defenses. The twang of bowstrings shattered the afternoon quiet. 3 scouts fell instantly, iron-tipped arrows sprouting from their chests like deadly flowers. The survivors scrambled back toward Alesia, shouting warnings in their guttural Celtic tongue. But Flavius knew their reports would only reinforce the Gallic misconception. that they faced standard Roman fieldwork, dangerous but not revolutionary. They could not know that Caesar had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of rapid fortification. In Gaul, in Germania, in Britannia, he had learned that victory often belonged not to the army with the strongest walls, but to the army that could build functional walls fastest. And function, the general had discovered, was far more important than appearance. The wooden palisades were deliberately deceptive. The logs were not simply driven into the ground. They were anchored with precisely angled braces that distributed the force of impact across the entire structure. When enemies threw themselves against what appeared to be a flimsy barrier, they would find themselves hitting a wall with the structural integrity of stone, but with the flexibility to absorb and redirect the energy of their assault. "Sir," message from the general, announced a dust-covered messenger who had ridden hard from Caesar's command post. "The relief army has been spotted. 60,000 Gauls, maybe more, moving up from the south. 3 days out, maybe 4. Flavius felt his stomach tighten. 60,000 warriors, plus the 30,000 already trapped in Alesia. The Romans would be outnumbered 4 to 1, caught between hammer and anvil, with nowhere to retreat and no reinforcements coming. It was exactly the situation Caesar had planned for. "Pass the word to all centurions," Flavius ordered. "Begin final preparations. Check every trap, every sightline, every firing position. And remind the men, those wooden walls they've been building, they're about to become the most important structures in the history of the Republic." As darkness fell over the plateau, the Roman camp transformed into a hive of purposeful activity. Soldiers sharpened stakes, tested bowstrings, and moved supplies to forward positions. The wooden walls that had drawn Gallic laughter during the day now seemed to pulse with hidden menace in the flickering torchlight. From his position atop the central command tower, Flavius could see the fires of Alesia burning like angry stars on the hillside. Somewhere in that fortress, Vercingetorix was planning his breakout attempt, confident that his relief army would crush the Romans between 2 forces and end Caesar's Gallic campaigns forever. The Gallic chieftain was a brilliant tactician, a natural leader who had united the fractious Celtic tribes against Rome for the first time in generations. But he was about to learn the difference between courage and engineering, between individual valor and systematic precision. The wooden walls waited in the darkness, patient as predators, ready to transform Gallic confidence into Roman victory. Tomorrow or the day after, those laughing warriors would discover that Rome's greatest weapon was not the gladius or the legion. It was the ability to turn any material, even humble wood, into an instrument of imperial will. The siege of Alesia was about to become a masterclass in the principle that had built an empire. Never judge Roman capabilities by Roman appearances. The most dangerous traps often looked like the simplest constructions. And these wooden walls were about to prove that lesson written in blood and victory across the hilltops of Gaul. If this story of Roman tactical brilliance intrigues you, hit that like button to support more historical deep dives, subscribe to join our community of history enthusiasts, and comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We love connecting with fellow history lovers across the globe. Day 2 of the final siege. Dawn, 51 BC. The morning brought no comfort to Marcus Flavius as he stood atop the wooden ramparts, watching the distant dust cloud that marked the approach of the Gallic relief army. The cold October air carried the sound of war horns echoing across the valleys, deep, mournful calls that spoke of Celtic pride and the promise of Roman blood. "They're closer than expected," Centurion Varro reported, his weathered face grim beneath his bronze helmet. "Scouts estimate 2 days, maybe less. And sir," he paused, clearly reluctant to deliver worse news, "the count has been revised upward. 80,000 warriors, not 60, maybe more." Flavius felt the weight of command settle heavier on his shoulders. 4 to 1 odds had just become 5 to 1. Behind them, 30,000 Gallic defenders remained trapped within Alesia's walls, while ahead, an army larger than any Celtic force in recorded history was marching to crush the Romans between stone and steel. For the first time since construction began, he questioned whether even Caesar's genius could overcome such overwhelming numbers. "Sir, there's something else," Varro continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The men are starting to talk. They're calling it Caesar's folly, this idea of fighting from behind wooden walls. Some of the veterans remember Crassus in Parthia, how he tried to use Roman engineering against impossible odds. The comparison stung because it held truth. Marcus Licinius Crassus had been one of Rome's most celebrated generals until he led 7 legions into the Parthian desert and never returned. The parallels were uncomfortable. Roman forces surrounded by enemies, relying on tactics that had never been tested on such a scale, commanded by a general whose ambition might exceed his wisdom. But Flavius had served under Caesar for 8 years, had watched him turn impossible situations into legendary victories. The wooden walls surrounding them were not acts of desperation. They were expressions of a military mind that saw patterns where others saw only chaos. "Gather the centurions," Flavius ordered. "All of them. It's time they understood what we're really fighting behind." An hour later, 40 centurions stood in the shadow of the wooden palisade, their faces reflecting the same mixture of determination and doubt that Flavius had seen in Varro's eyes. These were veteran soldiers, men who had conquered Gaul village by village, but they had never faced anything like this. "Look at these walls," Flavius began, placing his hand on one of the massive wooden uprights. "Tell me what you see." "Timber construction, sir," replied Marcus Brutus, not the famous senator but a grizzled centurion from the 10th Legion who shared the name. "Field fortifications, temporary defenses, exactly what the Gauls see." Flavius nodded. "But you're wrong, all of you." He drew his gladius and struck the wooden post with the flat of his blade. The sound that emerged was not the hollow thunk of simple timber, but a deep, resonant tone that spoke of sophisticated engineering. "These posts are not single logs," he explained. "Each one is actually 3 trees, bound together with iron bands and interlocking joints that distribute force like the bones in a man's arm. When the Gauls charge these walls, they won't be hitting wood. They'll be hitting a structure that flexes but never breaks." He led them along the palisade, pointing out details that most of the men had missed during construction. The wooden spikes were not randomly placed but positioned according to mathematical principles that created overlapping killing zones. The gaps between posts appeared irregular, but were actually calculated to confuse attackers while providing perfect sight lines for Roman archers. "And the towers?" Centurion Gaius Antonius asked, gesturing toward the wooden structures that rose every 100 yards along the fortification. "Each one can house 20 archers with overlapping fields of fire," Flavius replied. "But more importantly, they're connected by underground tunnels that allow rapid redeployment of forces. The Gauls will think they're attacking separate strong points, but they'll actually be fighting a single, coordinated defensive system." As they walked, Flavius could see understanding beginning to dawn in the veteran's eyes. These were not crude field fortifications. They were precision instruments of war, designed to channel enemy attacks into predetermined patterns of destruction. But it was the space between the walls that revealed Caesar's true genius. "The killing ground," Flavius announced as they emerged into the deadly no-man's land between the inner and outer palisades. 500 yards of carefully prepared death. The landscape looked innocuous enough, gently rolling terrain covered with autumn grass and scattered fallen leaves. But beneath that peaceful surface lay the most sophisticated collection of military traps ever devised. "First line of defense," Flavius pointed to seemingly random patches of disturbed earth. "Lilies. 300 concealed pits, each 3 feet deep and lined with sharpened stakes. The Gauls will see open ground and charge forward, only to find their cavalry impaled and their infantry scattered. Second line," he continued, moving deeper into the killing ground. "Wolf traps. Iron spikes angled to cripple men and horses, concealed in tall grass and positioned to channel survivors toward our archers. Third line." Flavius stopped at what appeared to be a natural depression in the earth. "Stimuli. Wooden stakes with fire-hardened points planted like a forest of spears and concealed beneath brush. Any force that survives the first 2 lines will find themselves trapped in a maze of death with no way forward and no way back." Centurion Varro knelt beside one of the concealed wolf traps, marveling at its construction. "How many men did we lose building all this?" 17 dead, 43 wounded, Flavius replied without hesitation. "But those 17 lives may save 20,000 when the Gauls attack." The mathematical precision of it was breathtaking. Caesar had calculated exactly how many casualties the Romans could afford in construction versus how many they would face in direct combat. Every trap had been positioned not randomly, but according to principles of geometry and psychology that would maximize enemy losses while minimizing Roman exposure. "Sir," called Centurion Marcus Brutus from near the outer wall, "movement on the southern approach." Flavius raised his hand to shield his eyes from the morning sun. In the distance, perhaps 5 miles away, the vanguard of the Gallic relief army had crested a low hill. Even at this distance, the sight was intimidating. Thousands of warriors moving in loose formation, their shields and spears glinting like a vast field of deadly grain. "How long?" Varro asked. "They'll probe our defenses tonight, Flavius estimated. Full assault tomorrow at dawn, maybe sooner if they're confident. As if summoned by their words, war horns sounded from within Alesia itself. Vercingetorix was no fool. He would coordinate his breakout attempt with the relief army's assault, catching the Romans in the jaws of a perfectly timed trap. Or so he thought. Return to your sentries, Flavius ordered the assembled centurions. Final inspections of all equipment. Check every arrow, every ballista bolt, every sword edge, and remind your men, tomorrow we make history. Either we prove that Roman engineering can triumph over any odds, or we die as witnesses to the principle that built our empire. As the officers dispersed to their units, Flavius remained in the killing ground, studying the approaching dust cloud that marked 80,000 enemies bent on Roman destruction. The wooden walls around him no longer seemed simple or crude. They pulsed with mathematical precision, each post and spike positioned according to principles that transformed timber into something harder than stone. The Gauls were still laughing at Rome's wooden fortifications. Tomorrow, they would learn that the deadliest traps often wore the most innocent faces, and that Roman genius lay not in building impregnable walls, but in building walls that turned enemy strength into enemy weakness. In the distance, Celtic war songs drifted across the autumn air, brave melodies that spoke of honor and glory and death in battle. But Flavius knew that courage, however magnificent, was no match for engineering, however humble its materials. The wooden walls of Alesia were about to teach Gaul the hardest lesson in military history. Never judge Roman capabilities by Roman appearances. Dawn of the third day. The trap springs. The attack came with the first pale light of dawn, announced by the thunderous roar of 80,000 Celtic voices raised in battle cry. Marcus Flavius felt the wooden ramparts vibrate beneath his feet, as the sound washed over the Roman fortifications like a physical force, carrying with it the promise of death and the scent of morning mist mixed with steel. Positions, he bellowed, his voice cutting through the cacophony of war preparations. Around him, legionaries moved with practiced efficiency, taking their places behind the deceptively simple wooden palisades that had drawn so much Gallic mockery. From his command post atop the central tower, Flavius could see the entire battlefield spread before him like a deadly tapestry. To the south, the relief army approached in a massive crescent formation, 80,000 warriors whose bronze shields caught the rising sun like a field of deadly mirrors. To the north, the gates of Alesia were grinding open as Vercingetorix prepared his simultaneous breakout. The Romans were about to be caught between two forces that outnumbered them 5-1. It was exactly the situation Caesar had engineered. "Sir, the Gauls are forming up just beyond artillery range," reported Centurion Varro, his weathered face tense but determined. "Their cavalry is massing on both flanks. Classic Celtic assault formation. They plan to overwhelm us with pure force." Flavius nodded grimly. The Gallic commanders had studied Roman tactics for decades. They knew that legionaries were disciplined but could be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. They knew that Roman engineering favored stone over wood, permanence over haste. What they didn't know was that Caesar had spent 2 years perfecting a new form of warfare, turning temporary fortifications into permanent death traps. The first Celtic war horn sounded, its deep note echoing across the valley like the voice of an angry god. The massive relief army began to move, slowly at first, then building momentum as thousands of warriors worked themselves into the battle fury that had made Gallic courage legendary throughout the ancient world. "Remember," Flavius called to his men, "let them come to the wooden walls. Let them laugh until they taste blood." The charge began as a distant rumble, like thunder rolling across summer hills. But as the Celtic warriors closed the distance, the sound grew into something else entirely, the roar of destiny itself, of two civilizations colliding with the force of avalanche. From Alesia, Vercingetorix's war horns answered the relief army's call. The fortress gates burst open and 30,000 Celtic defenders poured down the hillside, their war cries joining with those of their approaching kinsmen in a symphony of anticipated victory. The Romans were trapped, exactly where Caesar wanted them. "First line, hold," Flavius commanded as the initial wave of Celtic cavalry thundered toward the outer wooden walls. The riders came fast and confident, expecting to leap or smash through simple timber fortifications and carry their momentum into the Roman ranks. Instead, they found the lilies. The concealed pits opened beneath the charging horses like the earth itself had turned traitor. The first rank of cavalry simply vanished, their horses screaming as sharpened stakes found flesh and bone. Riders behind them tried to wheel away, only to discover that the innocuous-looking ground on either side was equally treacherous. "Now they learn," Flavius murmured, watching the Celtic charge dissolve into chaos, as warriors discovered that what appeared to be open ground was actually a carefully calculated killing field. But the Gauls were not easily discouraged. The surviving cavalry reformed and probed for gaps in the trap field, while infantry began advancing in loose formation, using spears to test the ground ahead of them. They were learning, adapting, finding ways through the maze of concealed death. It was exactly what Caesar had planned for. "Second line, prepare!" Flavius shouted. The Celtic infantry had found safe paths through the lilies and were advancing toward the wooden walls with renewed confidence. Their shields formed an unbroken line as they approached what appeared to be hastily constructed timber barriers. The wolf traps claimed them with mechanical precision. Iron spikes angled upward from concealed positions tore through Celtic legs and shields, channeling the advancing warriors into narrow corridors where Roman archers waited with mathematical patience. What had appeared to be random defensive positions revealed themselves as interconnected kill zones, each one designed to funnel enemies into the next level of destruction. "Archers loose," commanded Centurion Marcus Brutus from the wooden towers. 2,000 arrows arced through the morning air, their iron points seeking flesh with the precision of falling rain. The Gauls had expected to face Roman arrows, but not from these angles, not with this devastating accuracy. The wooden towers that had looked so crude and temporary were revealing their true nature. Each one had been positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that left no safe approach to the Roman lines. The Gauls found themselves trapped in channels of death, unable to advance, unable to retreat, unable to understand how simple wooden fortifications had become such sophisticated instruments of slaughter. But Celtic courage was legendary for good reason. Despite horrific losses, the warriors pressed forward, clambering over the bodies of their fallen comrades to reach the wooden palisades themselves. With axes and bare hands, they began attacking the timber barriers that had frustrated them all week, and discovered Caesar's final deception. The wooden posts that looked so crude and temporary did not yield to Celtic axes. Instead, they absorbed the impact and distributed it through a hidden network of interlocking supports. Warriors who had expected to hack through simple logs found themselves striking something with the structural integrity of stone, but the flexibility to turn their own force against them. "Third line, advance," Flavius commanded, as the Celtic assault stalled against the unyielding wooden walls. From concealed positions throughout the fortifications, Roman legionaries emerged with gladi drawn, using sally ports and hidden tunnels to appear behind enemy formations that thought they had penetrated Roman defenses. The wooden walls were not just barriers. They were bases of operation that allowed Roman forces to strike from unexpected directions while remaining protected by seemingly simple timber construction. From the north, Vercingetorix's breakout attempt was meeting similar frustration. The Celtic chieftain had timed his assault perfectly to coincide with the relief army's attack, but his warriors were discovering that the inner wooden walls were every bit as deceptive as the outer fortifications. Celtic ladders broke against hidden reinforcements. Grappling hooks found no purchase on posts that had been treated with oil and iron. What should have been a simple matter of overwhelming crude fieldwork became a nightmare of mathematical precision and engineering genius. "Sir," Centurion Varro's voice cut through the battle noise. "The Gauls are pulling back from the outer wall. They're regrouping for a concentrated assault." Flavius could see the Celtic commanders gesturing frantically as they tried to understand how their overwhelming numerical advantage had been neutralized by wooden fortifications. They were brave men, skilled tacticians, who had united the fractious Gallic tribes through military genius. But they were learning the hardest lesson in warfare. Numbers meant nothing against superior positioning. The concentrated assault came with the fury of desperate men who finally understood they were fighting not just Romans, but Roman mathematics. 20,000 warriors gathered into a massive wedge formation and hurled themselves at a single section of the outer wooden wall, hoping to overwhelm one point through sheer mass. The stimuli greeted them like a forest of death. The third line of traps consisted of fire-hardened wooden spikes planted so densely that advancing warriors found themselves impaled on multiple points simultaneously. What had looked like clear ground became a maze of pain that channeled attackers into predetermined positions where Roman ballistas waited with mechanical patience. The slaughter was methodical, mathematical, inevitable. Celtic courage met Roman engineering and discovered that bravery, however magnificent, could not overcome the laws of physics applied with genius precision. As the sun reached its zenith, The battlefield around Alesia had become a testament to a simple principle. The deadliest traps often wore the most innocent faces. Wooden walls that had drawn Gallic laughter for a week had become instruments of destruction, more effective than any stone fortification ever built. The relief army was retreating in disorder. Vercingetorix's breakout had stalled against the inner walls. And in the killing ground between the timber fortifications, 8,000 Celtic warriors lay dead or dying, their blood soaking into earth that had seemed so harmless from a distance. The wooden walls had proven their worth. Rome's humblest material had become its most sophisticated weapon. Sunset, third day, the price of wooden walls. The silence that fell over the plateau of Alesia was more terrible than any battle cry. Marcus Flavius stood atop the wooden ramparts as the October sun painted the sky the color of blood, surveying a battlefield that had become a monument to Roman engineering and Celtic courage. 8,000 warriors lay dead in the killing ground between the timber walls, their bodies creating a grotesque carpet that stretched from the outer palisade to the approaches of the inner fortifications. The wooden walls that had drawn such mockery 3 days ago now stood as silent witnesses to the most decisive victory in Gallic history. Not a single timber had been broken. Not one stake had been displaced. Caesar's deceptive fortifications had absorbed the fury of 80,000 warriors and emerged unscathed, their humble appearance concealing a sophistication that had revolutionized siege warfare forever. "Sir," Centurion Varro approached with measured steps, his face bearing the strange mixture of triumph and melancholy that followed overwhelming victory. "The relief army has withdrawn beyond the southern hills. Their commanders are arguing among themselves. Some want to regroup for another assault. Others are calling for retreat to their tribal lands." Flavius nodded without taking his eyes from the fortress of Alesia. The hilltop stronghold that had seemed so impregnable a week ago now looked strangely vulnerable, its stone walls dwarfed by the wooden ramparts that had proven more effective than any fortification in Celtic history. "And Vercingetorix?" he asked. "Still holding out, sir, but his men are starving. The breakout failed completely. We lost maybe 50 legionaries while they left 2,000 dead against the inner walls. Their morale is broken." The mathematics of siege warfare were as inexorable as those of battlefield engineering. 30,000 defenders consuming a finite supply of food with no hope of relief and no possibility of escape. Even Celtic pride had its limits when measured against empty stomachs and the corpses of fallen kinsmen. As if summoned by their conversation, the gates of Alesia began to grind open once again. But this time, no war cry echoed across the valley. Instead, a single figure emerged, tall, proud, wearing the golden torque of Celtic nobility and riding a magnificent war horse, whose hooves stepped carefully among the bodies of his fallen warriors. Vercingetorix had come to surrender. The Gallic chieftain rode slowly down the hillside, his path taking him through the killing ground where Roman engineering had shattered Celtic dreams of independence. He paused at each line of traps, the lilies that had claimed his cavalry, the wolf traps that had broken his infantry, the stimuli that had turned courage into catastrophe. His face showed no emotion, but Flavius could see the bitter understanding in his eyes. This was not just military defeat. This was the collision of two civilizations, and the mathematical precision of Roman engineering had proven superior to the individual heroism of Celtic warfare. Caesar himself emerged from the command tent to receive the surrender, his purple cloak brilliant against the weathered wood of the fortifications. The general who had conquered Gaul village by village, who had crossed the Rubicon and changed the course of history, now stood ready to accept the submission of the last great Celtic leader. The ceremony was brief and conducted without theatrics. Vercingetorix dismounted, removed his weapons and placed them at Caesar's feet. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. The wooden walls spoke more eloquently than any speech about the relationship between Celtic courage and Roman power. "Take him to Rome," Caesar commanded quietly. "He will grace my triumph." And then, the general's voice trailed off, but everyone present understood. Vercingetorix would be executed in the traditional manner, strangled in the depths of the Tullianum prison, as the crowd above celebrated Roman victory. As the former king of United Gaul was led away in chains, Flavius felt a strange sadness settle over the triumph. They had won completely, decisively, permanently. The wooden walls had proven that Roman engineering could overcome any odds, that intelligence and preparation could defeat courage and numbers. But victory had come at a price that went beyond the casualty counts. "Centurion," Flavius called to Marcus Brutus, who was supervising the collection of Celtic weapons from the battlefield. "What do you think we've accomplished here?" The grizzled veteran paused in his work, his eyes surveying the carnage that surrounded the deceptively simple wooden fortifications. "We've won Gaul for Rome, sir. Permanently." "Yes," Flavius agreed. "But what else?" Brutus frowned, considering the question. "We've proven that Roman methods can overcome any enemy resistance, that engineering matters more than individual bravery, that Caesar's genius can turn the humblest materials into instruments of victory." "All true," Flavius said slowly, "but I think we've done something else as well. We've shown that Rome can win any war against any odds, using any materials, and that terrifies me." The centurion looked puzzled. "Sir?" Flavius gestured toward the wooden walls that had made their victory possible. "Look at what we've built here. Simple timber fortifications that defeated the greatest Celtic army ever assembled. We've proven that Roman ingenuity has no limits, that Roman power can overcome any obstacle." He paused, watching as legionaries began the grim work of collecting bodies from the killing ground. But what happens to a republic that believes it can solve any problem through superior engineering? What happens to Roman virtue when Roman cleverness becomes more important than Roman character? The question hung in the evening air like smoke from the funeral pyres that would soon consume 8,000 Celtic warriors. Caesar's wooden walls had won more than a battle. They had demonstrated a principle that would reshape the ancient world. Roman engineering had proven superior to barbarian courage. Roman mathematics had triumphed over individual heroism. But in that triumph lay the seeds of something darker. As night fell over Alesia, Flavius walked the perimeter of the fortifications that had changed history. The wooden posts stood silent and unbreached, their humble appearance masking the sophisticated principles that had made victory inevitable. Tomorrow, Caesar would order them dismantled and burned, but their legacy would endure in the military manuals and siege tactics of future generations. The wooden walls had proven that Rome could turn any material into an instrument of conquest. Tree trunks became traps. Simple timber became sophisticated engineering. Humble appearance became devastating reality. It was a lesson that would echo through the centuries as Rome expanded beyond Gaul into Germania, into Britannia, into lands where Celtic courage would meet Roman mathematics again and again. Each time the outcome would be the same. Each time, engineering would triumph over heroism. But Flavius understood something that escaped most of his contemporaries. The wooden walls of Alesia had not just conquered Gaul, they had revealed the true nature of Roman power. It was not built on virtue or justice or the consent of the governed. It was built on the ability to turn any situation, any material, any principle, into an instrument of imperial will. The republic that had won through discipline and honor was transforming into an empire that would win through superior technology and mathematical precision. The wooden walls that had saved them today were harbingers of the steel and concrete that would one day stretch from Britain to Mesopotamia, and in that vast expansion, something essentially Roman would be lost forever. As the stars emerged over the blood-soaked plateau, Flavius offered a quiet prayer to the gods of his ancestors. They had won completely. They had proven Roman superiority beyond any doubt. They had turned humble wood into an instrument of conquest that would be remembered for 1,000 years. But in their triumph, they had also proven that Rome could win any war, overcome any obstacle, conquer any people, and that knowledge, more than any barbarian army, would ultimately prove fatal to the republic they had fought to defend. The wooden walls of Alesia stood victorious in the darkness, silent witnesses to the day when Roman engineering had triumphed over Celtic courage and changed the course of human history forever. History would remember the siege of Alesia as Caesar's greatest victory, but the gods remembered it as the day Rome learned it could turn anything, even simple wood, into an instrument of conquest. And in that lesson lay both the triumph and the tragedy of an empire that would rule the world and lose its soul in the process. The wooden walls had taught Gaul to fear Roman ingenuity, but they had also taught Rome to trust in engineering over virtue, in cleverness over character, in imperial power over republican principle. In the end, the greatest trap at Alesia was not the one that caught the Gauls. It was the one that caught Rome itself. The end